today. This is another book in the Alton School series. If you remember us reading Double Double, Trouble Trouble, it was about Nick Everett. This is another book in that series. Things are what they are, right? Well, not always. Sometimes how you look at something makes all the difference. Just ask Nick Everett as he takes on his school principal in The Great Debate. The Great Debate by Michael Sullivan, illustrated by Priscilla Burris. The principal of Alton School was very angry. His face was red and his eyebrows were so scrunched up they almost touched. His mouth was opening and closing, but you couldn't hear him over the roar of the lunchroom. Finally, he stood on a chair and banged 2 plastic trays together. The lunchroom got quiet. "I've had it," Principal Potter yelled. "You students are just too noisy. I am declaring tomorrow to be no talking day. No student will be allowed to talk from the moment you step into the school until the moment you leave. Not a sound, not one word." Immediately, everyone in the lunchroom started yelling, "No fair! No way! No pickles!" Billy Parker never listened, but he always liked to contribute to a conversation. "Well," the principal asked over the hubbub, "can anyone give me a good reason why I shouldn't make you all be silent for just one day?" Nobody said anything. No one in his right mind would argue with a principal, would they? Nick Everett would. "That's not fair," he said. "Students should have a say in this decision. It's our school, too." "Fine," said the principal. "We can debate this tomorrow at a morning assembly. But since it will already be no talking day, it will be a silent debate." "What's a silent debate?" Nick asked. "We'll act it out," the principal explained. "I will act out 3 points I want to make. You will have to figure out each one and then act out your answers. If you can do that, no talking day will end right there. But if you miss even one, it will be no talking week." The kids in the lunchroom gasped and stared at Nick. He was their last hope. They were doomed. The next morning, Alton School was silent as the teachers and students filed into the auditorium. On one side of the stage was the principal, looking impressive in his business suit and best tie. On the other side stood Nick. Erin Mitchell sat on the front row with note cards and a marker in her lap. Erin was Nick's best friend and the smartest kid in school. She had offered to give Nick any help she could. Miss Mallow, the English teacher, sat down beside Erin. She looked at the note cards in Erin's lap, but she didn't say anything, of course. Nobody said anything. There wasn't a sound in the whole auditorium. The principal waited until every seat was filled. Then he began the debate. He clapped his hands over his ears and screwed his face up into a look of pain. Nick watched, but the principal didn't move. This must be the first point he wanted to make. Erin looked at Miss Mallow. Miss Mallow looked at Erin. "Do you understand?" Erin wrote on a card. She showed it to Miss Mallow. Miss Mallow shook her head no. Nick looked at Erin for help, but she held up a note card with 3 big question marks. He was on his own. Nick stared back at the principal. Then he spread his arms wide and turned a full circle, waving his arms in every direction. Miss Mallow took a card from Erin and wrote, "What was that?" Erin shrugged. Up on the stage, the principal looked surprised at Nick's gyrations, but he nodded and acted out his second point. He pointed to his head, winked, and put his finger across his lips. Nick looked quickly at Erin, who looked over at Miss Mallow with a pleading look in her eyes, but Miss Mallow just looked at her. She had no idea what it meant. What was that? Nick thought for a second. He looked meaningfully at Principal Potter. He pointed to his feet and then pointed to his mouth. "He's going to vomit on his shoes," Aaron wrote. Miss Mallow looked worried. Aaron's guess was as good as any. The principal looked shocked, but he nodded at Nick. Then he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a shiny yellow apple. He held it up in front of Nick. Clearly, he was using the apple to act out his third point. His look said, "Gotcha this time." Nick looked to Aaron for help, but she just threw her cards into the air. It was obvious what that meant. "I give up." Nick looked confused. He didn't move. Was this the end of the debate? After a long moment, Nick's face lit up. He had an idea. He reached for his backpack. He took out a whoopie pie and held it up in front of the principal. Principal Potter looked crushed. He lowered his head and quietly said just 2 words. "You win." In the silent auditorium, it sounded like he shouted it. Later, the teachers gathered around the principal in the teacher's lounge and asked, "What was the debate about? We didn't understand any of it." "It was amazing that Nick Everett, of all people, could read my actions so well," said the principal. He explained, "First, I covered my ears and looked pained. I was showing that the noise in this school is so bad that people can't hear themselves think." But then Nick raised his arms and spread them all around. He was saying that the whole world is a noisy place, so we just have to get used to it. "That makes sense," said the music teacher. Principal Potter continued. "Next, I pointed to my brain. I winked and put my finger over my mouth to show that the smartest people are usually the quiet ones." But then Nick pointed to his feet and to his mouth to show that if the quiet students would stand up and speak out for themselves, this school would be a better place. The teachers nodded. They understood. "Then I was sure I had him," the principal shook his head. "I held up a golden apple to remind him of the saying, 'Silence is golden.' But then he held up a whoopie pie." "What did that mean?" an eager teacher asked. Principal Potter looked surprised she didn't know. "Whoopee equals fun," he said. "Nick was reminding me that young people deserve to have a good time. Who cares if they're a little noisy? Fun is more precious than gold. That Nicholas Everett is smarter than I ever imagined." Meanwhile, on the playground, students gathered around Nick. Aaron asked, "What was the debate about? We didn't understand any of it." "It wasn't much of a debate, if you ask me," Nick said. First, Principal Potter looked like he was hurting and put his hands over his ears. He was saying that he was going to yell into my ears until it hurt, so I would understand how the noise feels to him. So I waved my arms and showed him everyone in the room. I was telling him he couldn't do that in front of all those witnesses. One kid nodded. "Smart," he said. Then Principal Potter pointed to his head and shushed me. Nick repeated the principal's movements. He was telling me that if I was smart, I'd shut up. So I pointed to my feet and my mouth. I was telling him that as long as I am faster than he is, I can say anything I want. He can't catch me. A few kids nodded. "But what about the apple?" Aaron asked. "Then I guess he got hungry. He brought out his lunch, and so I brought out mine," Nick explained. The next day, the principal was standing in the cafeteria, which was just as loud as ever. He saw Nick and Aaron walking to a table with their lunches, and he waved at Nick to get his attention. The principal pointed to his eye, then to his head. Next, he put a fist over his heart. He wanted Nick to know that in his heart, he understood how smart Nick really was. Aaron looked at Nick and asked, "What was that about?" "Principal Potter thinks he has heartburn," Nick said. We'd better not eat the meatballs. Learning more about Jewish folklore. The Great Debate is based on a very old Jewish story. For hundreds of years, the Jewish religion would not allow stories where animals acted like people. So, old Jewish stories tend to be about people and some of the silly things that they do. Jewish stories are often about wise men and fools. Your job as the reader is to figure out which characters are the fools and which are the wise men. And when the story is very good, the fool can become the wise man, and the wise man can become the fool. So, who in the Great Debate is foolish and who is wise? That, like everything else in this story, depends entirely on your point of view. I hope you enjoyed that book, The Great Debate. Now we're going to do some questions. So I want you to get out a pencil and a piece of paper, and you can write the answers to your questions, or you can turn and talk to someone in your family. Okay, so the first question that I have for you is about the ending. Did you like the ending to this story? If you liked the ending, I want you to start your sentence with, I liked this ending because. And if you didn't like the ending, you're going to start your sentence with, I did not like the ending because. You can pause the video and answer. The second question that I have for you is about the title. What makes the title, The Great Debate, a good title for this book? You can pause the video and you can answer. And the last question, I'm going to show you page 12 because we're going to talk about page 12 in this question. On page 12, do you think that Principal Potter knew how Nick Everett was feeling? And what makes you think that? You can start your sentence with, I think Principal Potter knew how Nick felt because, or I don't think Principal Potter knew how Nick felt because. I hope that you enjoyed this book, The Great Debate. I really enjoyed reading to you this week, and I will see you again next week with another book. Bye!